Welcome to the Mothers on the Frontline podcast. Mothers on the Frontline is a nonprofit organization founded and run by mothers of children with mental health conditions to promote caregiver healing, caregiver justice, and children's mental health justice through storytelling. Please note that we are sharing our experiences as mothers. Nothing on this podcast should be considered medical or legal advice.
In this episode, we are going to discuss 4 concepts that are part of our theoretical foundations at Mothers on the Frontline. The first concept is that social policy is ideology in action. The definition of ideology that we're working with is a belief system that forms operating principles and informs how people and policies operate. Many ideologies work by remaining hidden, by not being explicitly discussed or recognized. And that's particularly true with the kind of ideologies that Mothers on the Frontline is interested in, such as ideologies around motherhood, disability, and children. Our work at Mothers on the Frontline seeks to make these ideologies visible by discussion so we can show how they operate in social policies, public policies, and institutional policies. Deanne, what does it mean to say that social policy is ideology in action?
When we talk about social policy as being ideology in action, we're really talking about the ways in which social policies and our social policy is just a side of what we mean by social policy, or what when we're talking about social policy, what we mean policies that deal with housing. Social policy domains are housing, policies that deal with economics, and not like this kind of like market economics where we're really looking at stock markets and things like that. We're talking about the sort of micro type of economics of like how much we pay for eggs and bread, and who actually has the opportunity or the ability, right, to food, housing, safety, and I'm not talking about like the big kind of like foreign security safety, but these kind of safety issues that really get at the heart of a lot of things that affect us as families, right, and communities and society. And so when we say that social policy is ideology in action, you can actually see a lot of the ideological principles. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, and we'll talk about it again in future podcasts, that there are some central ideologies around capitalism in the United States, which really structure what we think about work. So who deserves care, who deserves a safety net, who, when people cannot work, right, or are unable to work, or are unable to secure a full-fledged income, right, and a full-fledged life from the work that they do. Mothers being one group of people who are not necessarily paid for the labor that we do. And if we are doing labor sort of outside of the home, women in general are often paid less for that labor and need other safety and support structures and safety net structures that we consider to be part of the social policy network. So how we make these decisions as to whether or not people are deserving of care, deserving of support, deserving of some sort of structural or ways to meet structural differences and structural inequities is really how we see the ideologies practicing. So whether or not we have a strong and robust social policy and strong and robust safety net, whether or not we have policies that guarantee housing and guarantee income for people, whether or not we have policies that help to meet structural inequalities and structural inequities, these are all in social policy, and how we choose to apply those policies, who we choose to give those policies to, or policies, who we choose to give those resources to, and how we even understand resource distribution in this way is really fundamentally guided by ideology. And then we can actually reverse that and kind of reverse engineer it and see how that is practiced in the social policies.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing I know from our previous conversations that I've really learned from you as a political scientist and in your work in policy studies, is that how we make invisible policies that help certain people, but make problematic policies that help other groups of people. So like as you're sort of saying, like policy, right, draws boundaries of who's deserving and who's not. So policies that help some people get tax breaks for owning a home or for doing certain things, those are not seen as entitlements. Those are just seen as earned. Whereas things like the idea of universal income for those who have disabilities or, the poor are seen as entitlements, right?
Yeah, it's
not deserving something, right? That's how it's constructed. Is those are the boundaries drawn. Yeah.
And it's really important for us at Mothers on the Front Line, right? Because what you're talking about, I mean, people, it's kind of gone out of vogue to talk about welfare policy and like how we talk about welfare in general. But, welfare, particularly in the United States, when we're referring to welfare and welfare policies, we are usually only referring to a certain set of programs that are really targeted towards lower income individuals and lower income families, largely, predominantly, because poverty is feminized, particularly in the United States, women and children, right? And we could talk about this at length in a different episode, but why it's so important to us is exactly what you're talking about in terms of work. There's so many ideologies that are really about contribution, right?
Yeah.
And who is actually contributing.
Yeah.
So if I own a business and I'm a business owner, then I am actually contributing to society. I'm contributing jobs. I'm contributing to security. I'm contributing to the tax base. And so business owners in the US in particular are usually first tier in getting types of tax breaks, even fundamentally getting government rebates. They get a lot of social welfare, right? So when we were back in 2000, when the US was actually looking at not redesigning, but reinitiating, re-upping the 1996 welfare reform, one of the things that came out and one of the things that we saw is that companies like Walmart actually were some of the biggest recipients of government subsidies, so much so that a lot of people who worked at Walmart were actually in need of some sort of safety net programming and some sort of public service, either through EBT, getting nutritional benefits, housing benefits through Section 8. So a good majority of their workers were also receiving government benefits, but they are often constructed as undeserving, right? And when you think about it in terms of gender and particularly motherhood, mothers are never constructed as being contributors, key contributors to society, and therefore worthy of any type of this sort of same kind of rebates and tax breaks. Mothers get welfare, and mothers get relegated to one of the stingiest, most restrictive, and definitely one of the most stigmatized programs in the United States. And it used to be AFDC. It's now Transitional Aid to Needy Families, or Personal Responsibility and Work Reconciliation Act. Very, very stingy, because it's actually a way in which we understand what mothers do as not being contributory. And so what you're talking about, I always like to, and I think it's the professors in us, right? Like point to like, where does a lot of this come from? And my thinking and my understanding comes from a scholar and researcher by the name of Deborah Stone. And I always recommend this book. Like, this is the book that I say everybody should read. If you are a technocrat, if you are a citizen, if you're a teacher, and it's Policy Paradox and the Art of Political Reasoning. And she says that every idea about policy draws boundaries. It tells us what or who is included or excluded in a category. And these boundaries are more than intellectual. So it's not just like us as a bunch of like scholars and Tammy as a philosopher deciding on these boundaries, but these boundaries define, as she says, they define people in and out of a conflict or a place and place them on different sides. And so that's what we mean by ideology in action. Mothers are placed on one side of need and deserving and actually contributing in a way to society, and business owners are placed on a different side, and mothers are often constructed as, this is not something that is motherhood is deserving of and contributing to society in a way that I actually deserve business protections, a pension, all of the things that we talk about and more when we talk about like business and business leaders. Contributing members of society rarely are termed mothers, oddly enough.
Contributing member of society means economically contributing. And
Yes.
that's how and this brings us to the sort of next concept we want to discuss, which is that narratives express and perpetuate ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the scripts that are given around motherhood, the narratives or the stories of society tells itself to explain the world. And we also wanted to sort of make sure we mention that it's not just words and stories, it's also controlling images. This important concept by Patricia Hill Collins, right, that stereotypical representations that reinforce stereotypes that are used to justify inequalities can exist in imagery. And especially in our world today, where so much of our communication and absorption of society comes through visual imagery, as well as narrative. So I thought I would hand it back to you to talk about like how narratives and controlling images are used to construct and signal both individuals and groups as either deserving of care or deserving of punishment. So
I think this is this is so important. It's almost like the terra firma, this idea of narratives and controlling images. I think it's probably one of the cornerstones of how we even started Mothers on the Front Line and our aha moment, right? Because narratives and controlling images, first of all, it's not like a narrative is not a static thing and a controlling image is not a static thing. And they're actually working. It's like a didactic and they're working together, right? So they're reinforcing, they are also, we could use things and they're disrupting each other and they're changing. And so one of the things that was like just powerful, I think very early on, back in 2017, when we started talking about this, is when we just started comparing, even across racial lines, right? Some narratives that were really consistent, right? That we were actually encountering. So the narrative, like you just said, is this sort of explaining, it's the story that we tell to explain the world around us. And it's our basic building block, I think, as human beings, of actually transferring information. We have the internet, we have data, but we're still largely, we're just like, as I like to say, chimpanzees with better technology and language, and we tell stories. Like, this is how this got to be. And in every story, right, there's climaxes, there are, triumphs, there are valleys, but there's also villains and heroes, right? And so these controlling images that Hill Collins is talking about become these stereotypical representations that you can often see in narrative. In Hill Collins's case, what she's talking about are controlling images, or these images and stereotypes that you can pick out literally in almost every narrative and racial story where you're talking about African American women. And there's some dominant ones that really come into play, what we're going to talk about next too, that have to do with like mammies and Jezebel, fit to care but not fit to mother, and not deserving of care on the one end. And she talks about these as these dominant narratives and controlling images that not only are sort of self-perpetuating, but as an African-American woman, whether you are or you aren't, you are stepping into, when you step into an institution, when you step into school, when you are just sort of stepping into public life, you are also not competing, that's not a good word. You are also encountering these narratives and these controlling images, whether you are aware of them and whether you can identify them, they are operating, and they are also constructing how you experience your life and how you experience just being, right? And so
we internalize them. They're not just externally around us.
No.
We internalize them in our self-concept, in our self-evaluation, in the way we think about our interactions with others. So it's not just, it's social and interpersonal and structural, but it's also internal life.
Yeah, we embed them in institutions, right? So if you can imagine, I am not the philosopher in this conversation. You are. So I'm going to beg a little bit of rope here, or not rope, but a little bit of like grace as I do the philosophical experiment of, if you can imagine coming from a complete state of innocence and being dropped, right, into, say, a school, and you are kind of going through school, but you're in my body, you are encountering these images and these narratives, whether or not somebody's actually saying it to you, because this goes back to social policy and ideology, they are meted out in how the policies are constructed, why you just make less money. You make, 80, what is it, 80 cents on the dollar now? 30 cents. I can't remember I have to look on my cheat sheet on what the structure and the gender and pay inequity. You can, like, when I talk to my students, I always have the joke, like, internally, I can construct myself and I know who I am internally, but externally, in terms of these controlling images and these dominant narratives about my worth and about my work, when I encounter and I go out in society, these are the things that are operating. And how they become internalized is because my ability or inability to recognize it. And this is going back to, I think, one of the things that I feel like being part of Mothers on the Frontline, being in friendship and being in community with other mothers of children who have mental health conditions, this is where the power has happened for me, because it has allowed me to both recognize the narratives by talking to other people and going, wait, this is happening to you. This is happening to you. And we talk about this a lot, like, it's not just idiosyncratic. It wasn't just me that when I walked into the hospital, such and such hospital, this happened to her, this happened to her, this happened. See, this is now a narrative. This is now a structure, and it allows us to both recognize the narrative and then start to name the images, right? And disrupt.
I love that you said that, because I think we have another podcast on how we came to be mothers in the frontline. And so this will be addressed there. But part of our frustration with communities in which we participated before we started this organization and rhetoric that we encountered is, yes, it's important to know that you're not alone in a mental health journey and a caregiving journey. So that is important. But that alone is not enough, because not only are you not alone, you are intentionally in a group that was created to be this way.
Yeah.
It's not an accident that you're in this situation, and it's not an accident that you're not alone in this situation.
And it's not an accident that you feel that way, right? The internalization.
Absolutely. Yes. And you have to have a raised consciousness of that before you can have real solidarity to make change around these issues. And this brings us to the next concept for today, which is that motherhood is a political identity. And that is important to understand if there's going to be any solidarity and work around improving the plight of mothers, right? Is understanding it's a political identity. I mean, for feminism, it's always been said that the personal is a political. But I think for us, this work was really important because as academic feminism hasn't been so great about addressing motherhood. There's some exceptions to this, but for a large part, motherhood is sort of pushed away. I mean, we even presented at a very important feminist conference, and we were like put way in the corner of the conference,
Well, we're old enough. I know you're old enough to remember when we first started our careers, our academic careers. I was told, don't talk about the fact that you are a mother.
Yeah.
Don't bring in to any kind of conversation, professional conversation, personal professional, which is not like giving a speech or anything or a talk. Don't ever, ever talk about parenting or motherhood or pregnancy or anything, because people will not only not take you seriously as a scholar, but it will diminish like this is not the appropriate place, which I think is different than people not taking you seriously. This is just not the appropriate place. To be intellectual is to scrub yourself of these connections, right? That are essential connections. This is what rubbed wrong for me. Not only before I became a parent, it rubbed me wrong because as a Black person, my connections to my community, my connections to my family are the things that gave me strength, not only gave me power, but also why I was there. And people were saying, no, as an academic, to be a true intellectual is not to be connected in community with anyone. It's to be this kind of singular kind of brain and thinking and pure. I don't know if you were told the same thing.
Yeah, that the pure objectivity of distancing yourself, of not being biased by relationality, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some exceptions to this, and we're both interested and tied into them. I mean, from one point of view, there are scholars that we're involved with who do motherhood studies. So, for instance, Andrea O'Reilly has actually tried to work hard to start a whole area studies around motherhood, and has done a good job in Canada and internationally. IAMAS, the International Association of Maternal Action and Scholarship, works on this, but it's still a big push to move this in academia. There's also womanism. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, because we were talking about this before we started recording, that in womanism, I mean, womanism within the area of, and I'm hesitating to say Black feminisms because a lot of Black womanists don't identify as Black feminism. So if you think about like gender studies and women's studies in this kind of bubble, and I'm going to do like, this could be its own episode. So if anybody's watching, anybody's listening, and personally colleagues of mine who are womanist scholars, I'm just going to give myself a little caveat and say, I'm sorry if I'm going to butcher this, but quickly. So if you just kind of take Black gender studies and Black women who do gender studies, right? And the break apart between womanism and feminism, part of the development of womanism and Black womanism really had to do with its need to disrupt and to actually push back on what we were been talking about with academic feminism, everything from relationality, right? So the strength in how we relate to community, but also motherhood, right? And embedding. And so where womanism has really flourished, most academic feminists, so even Black feminists, if you're studying like mainstream academic feminism, understand womanism through the lens of an Alice Walker piece on womanism. And that's where everybody points to. But in mainstream academic feminism, that's usually the period at the end of the sentence. So like I teach intro to gender studies class, and you might have one article, it would be Alice Walker's article, but womanism is an entire area of ethics, of intellectual activity and research, and where it has actually blossomed and gained its whole structural full force is actually within religion and theological studies. And so if anybody's interested in really understanding how and the central canons of womanism and the central tenets of womanism, then you should look at the work of Katie Cannon. And Katie Cannon is a Black, or was, a Black theological and religious scholar who really took and looked at exactly some of the things that you just said. What are the problems, right? And how we understand relationality, right? And particularly as a spiritual concept, and I'm talking a religious concept, but also race, right? You cannot, one of the central tenets of womanism is the relationality and the aspect of really being in community cannot be wrested away, and to pull us away from community, to pull us away from that sort of relationality is not only a problem, it just basically it basically pushes away the central things that really, in essence, how many of us as Black women define ourselves, and not ideologically, but through our identity. I hope that was.
No, that's very helpful. And I think it's interesting as we started Mothers on the Frontline, I mean, you and I are academics and scholars. And so we had our own frustration about not being able to find a place in the academy to discuss our motherhood journey as we're having it around raising a child with invisible disabilities and these kind of and mental health conditions and these kind of things. But all three of us, you, I, and Angela, we've all had various parts of our lives in advocacy and activism. And even we've felt this feeling of not being seen or represented. And for instance, in the reproductive rights movement, motherhood has also been neglected, which is why we've always, as an organization, identified with the reproductive justice movement. Could you say a bit about that?
So reproductive justice, I mean, in the quick things, the right to have a child is the right to parent, right not to parent, the right to raise your children in a community, basically the right to raise your children in what T.H. Marshall was called, he's a social policy theorist, the full-fledged benefits and rights of the society that you're a part of, meaning your right to water, your right to safety, all of these things, you have a right to that. And then the fourth one has been added recently, the right to sexual pleasure and sexual autonomy, right? And so that's like very, very quickly. And one of the things that I think for us as mothers on the front line, not only the right to parent, and we could talk about reproductive justice, and I think it deserves its own like element and discussion of how it actually centers and focuses on our work at Mothers on the Front Line in another podcast and another discussion. But one of the things is that reproductive justice, I think, recognizes for us this complexity of care, right? And this gets back to womanism, relationality. I mean, you're going to hear us talk, if you listen to enough podcasts, and this is just, I think we talk about relationality a lot. And I think it's also really important to recognize that, at least for me as a scholar, as an activist, as an advocate, some of the most important thinkers and theorists around relationality are Black and Indigenous scholars and workers, because community is really in that central element. But care requires, and we talk about this in a previous podcast or another podcast, the care and relationality of care. And reproductive justice, I think, recognizes this complexity of care. And if you think about my right to parent or my right not to parent, like I don't have to, I can feel like I have a duty to care, right? And what we talk about as Mothers on the Front Line, you have a duty to care, and you also have a right to care, right? And it's different from being obligated because of your social role. Yeah. And because of an identity that has been constructed for you, right? So no one has this sort of obligation because institutions, policy, society, culture, even like, and that could be religious, it could be familial, has told you because you are the girl, because you are this, you are obligated to care for everyone else, right? So care can't be compulsory and it can't be housed in a social identity. And it wasn't until reproductive justice, that's not something we talk about in reproductive rights, right? This is something I think that really blossoms, and we had an opportunity as an organization and as advocates to really think about this really through the reproductive justice lens.
Yeah. One of the things that is important about the idea that motherhood is a political identity is how it's purposely made to not look as though it is so that it can operate as one, which is a bit of a strange thing to say. But society has a way of erasing motherhood, of making it invisible, while at the exact same time using it as a political device. And it does this by trying to present motherhood, whatever the current motherhood ideology is, as natural, and therefore making it not seem historically or culturally situated or not politically motivated, even though it is. The way it does a lot of work is through mother blame. Mother blame is what happens to any mother that does not conform to the current motherhood ideology. And we're in the United States, and particularly the history of motherhood ideologies in the United States have always been incredibly political. And so this sort of gets us to The fourth concept we're going to talk about.
And I'm going to read it because I want you
Yes.
to talk about it. You have, I mean, you are doing, I'm just going to take this opportunity to glow you up, as I probably used that wrong. My daughter's going to be really embarrassed when she sees this, but to take this opportunity to really lift up the work that you're doing in this area. So the fourth one is mother blame is used to control individuals and communities. And I just would like you to say more.
Thank you. So this sort of begins with something I think people know, but maybe don't know or haven't thought about enough. And that is in history, global history, but right now I'm focusing on US history in particular, women, including mothers, have had to take on various roles during times of war that have traditionally been gendered male. But then when the war's over, there are these cultural pressures to put them back in their place as women, right? This has happened over and over. And we can see various examples of this by looking at US history, by examining various ideologies of motherhood. And I think the reason I want to talk about this is it helps you see the kind of political work that motherhood ideologies do and how mother blame works. So in the very beginning of our nation in the United States, you have Republican motherhood. So after the Revolutionary War, there's this attempt to again pull mothers back into the privatized location, out of the public sphere, get them back in their place. But it was done in a kind of way that gave women maybe more of a kind of political role than they had before, but still is limiting them at the same time. So what Republican motherhood does is it sees mothers now as responsible for having a political role of raising good citizen sons and taking care of the hearth and home in which those citizen sons are raised so that they can become good citizens of the republic. And yeah, but I would say it's one last thing and then take it from there. So motherhood now is a civic duty. It isn't political. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm just going to underscore like with some like examples, because when you're thinking about this, I'm thinking about, part of this change is because you have this nation, right? And this nation, it's so connected also to forms of nativism and forms of not colonialism, but empiricism, right? So now you're not just the mother in the home, but you're the mother of the nation, because we have this new republic that now needs to have fit citizens and fit sons in order to inhabit the new republic and to grow the republic. So now, you're growing this, and this is right? Like this is part of what this Republican motherhood is, that being a mother and being a certain type of mother is not just this kind of home and hearth thing in your family and in this sort of local tribalism. It becomes the civic duty to grow the country, so the country becomes this kind of strong entity.
This is so important what you just said, because a lot of times people want to talk about parenting in a gender neutral way. And one of the things we argue about mothers on the front line is you have to be very careful about that, because parent blame is not ungendered. It's always mother blame. And there's a historical genealogy that explains why this is that way. And this is Republican motherhood is part of that. It is when you just said this, right? When you are a unfit mother, you're not just letting down the child or the family, you're letting down the country. And so it takes on a kind of demonization of being a bad mother that is really important. We also see this after World War II with what Andrea Riley and others call normative motherhood, right? That normalizes a very narrow form of motherhood, white, middle class, within a nuclear family household, married to the breadwinning man. And so there's so many things that are constructed in what this normative motherhood looks like that we still have existing today that comes from that time period, right? And so again, these deserve their own episodes to get into more deeply, but a few other things I want to point out is it's not just about, okay, after war, bringing women back out of the, Rosie the
Factory.
Riveter position back into the home. That's a big part of these ideologies and what they did. But the motherhood ideologies are also affected by contemporary scientific trends, which will reflect and perpetuate existing motherhood ideologies, but they adapt them in various ways that are often, again, used to control certain populations. And so I want to talk about two examples of this as well. In the early 20th century, I mean, really in the like 1890s to the 1940s, we get a movement in the progressive movement, right, of this time period that's deeply influenced by eugenics. And you have this arising view of motherhood ideologies that are based in eugenics and euthenics. In fact, mother blame is very much part of that background. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Okay. Yeah, because I want to loop, because before we get into eugenics and euthenics and Republican motherhood, to loop back to what we were talking about earlier in social policy is ideology and action. On both of these, Republican motherhood and normative motherhood, we actually get social policy. So in Republican motherhood, post-Revolutionary War, we have our first pension systems that are set up after the Revolutionary War. And also in between this, it comes up again around the Civil War, and you have mothers' pensions that are really to support wives and widows and mothers of revolutionary and Civil War male combatants. But all of these things became all of these policies, and in order to receive the pensions, first of all, you had to be married, you had to prove. So this is already setting up a certain type of who's a good mother, who's not a good mother. And again, we'll talk about this. Single motherhood is definitely in what you call the mother blame category. To be a mother without, and widowhood is in a different category. So widows we're responsible for caring for. And so it sets up who gets the policy, not policies, but who gets the benefits, right, are really inscribed through these social policies, and these social policies around mothers' pensions. And then after World War II, AFDC, and then ADC, Aid to Dependent Children, really had a strong effect in terms of social policy of talking about what is normal, right? A normal form of motherhood, white, middle class, married, right? And what is stigmatized and blamed forms of mothering. So I just wanted to highlight that because it does, I think, loop into what you're about to talk about with eugenics and euthenics.
Yeah, absolutely. And throw in there nuclear family too, because you could do a whole episode on the policies around that. because that's not historically consistent. That arises particularly after World War II. So I think we need to, like, that's a whole economic driver of housing and things like that as well.
Yeah.
So I'll talk a bit about eugenics and euthenics, and then after that, I'll talk a bit about our contemporary ideology of motherhood, which is intensive mothering, which grows out of that, but further adapts to contemporary psychiatry, neuroscience, and so forth. And we can talk more about that after. But in terms of eugenics, what happens with eugenics is there's this construction of the fit mother that happens alongside the construction of a fit child. So you used the word fit earlier when we were talking about Republican motherhood, but that's like fit as a good citizen. What starts to happen with eugenics, it's fit as a desirable biological human being. Like now it's it's an issue of you as a biological organism, as a human being, as being fit, right? That's the eugenics nature of it, which we saw where this ended up in the Holocaust and so forth. I mean, it's a horrible, eugenics is a horrible thing, and what it leads to. What I think most of us today don't know about is how so many policies and so many social constructions like mother blame have deep roots in this eugenic history. And so eugenics was seen as a way to improve the race through heredity. Okay, and that's what people in the early 20th century that's how they viewed it. It's a science to try to improve humanity through heredity, whether it's by preventing some people from reproducing or encouraging other people to reproduce, right?
And it even like moves so far as to, I mean, you could see like a lot of eugenics in terms of at this point, when you're talking about like 1940s, 1890s, through immigration policies. And so which groups we are allowing, Chinese Exclusion Act had a lot, first version and second version, had a lot to do with, if I'm not mistaken, this hereditary, like you have to like contain certain types of what they call containing contagion, and then not allowing certain people into the US.
Exactly. And it also has to do with reproductive policies of forced sterilization of certain groups, including people with disabilities, including people of certain races and so forth. And this was happening in the US. The Germans got it from us. Right. See the PBS eugenics documentary if you're completely unfamiliar with this history. And what I think most of us aren't familiar with is euthenics. So euthenics and eugenics were movements that were very much connected. And euthenics was the idea of improving the race through environment. So to help sort of understand what this means and how embedded it is, I want to actually read a quote from the work that definition of euthenics comes from. And the reason I think it's important to talk about euthenics is I didn't even know what this word meant when I came across it earlier this year. But as I started doing research, even my own college, I'm at a small liberal arts college, had a concentration in euthenics in the 19th century, early 20th century. And this was an area of study. And we've erased this history because it's so ugly, we don't want to remember it. And it's important not to, if you don't want to repeat history, you have to understand it. And so I think it's important to talk about. Before I do that, I want to just give an example of eugenics that I think people would be surprised about. At least I was. Maybe I'm naive. But one of the examples of this movement are baby contests, which started actually in the Iowa State Fair and the Kansas State Fair, and they were based on pig contests. And the idea
when you
was
said state fair.
Right. The idea was mothers would come to show off their babies, and the healthiest baby would win to show the best mothers who brought the best genetic child. And then that started to move into euthenics to raise the best child, right? Who provide the best home environment to get that kind of child. So you can start to see how motherhood is responsible for the citizenry and how good that citizenry is, then starts to be connected to eugenics. What is a pure bloodline? What is a good bloodline? And so forth, right? Which during the racist brings in these racist elements, anti-immigration elements and so forth that we see in various policies throughout various points of the 20th century that literally are linked to eugenics.
Can I just
Yes, you may.
Because first of all, I mean, euthenics, I wrote a lot about, as you know, the early progressives and their benevolent assimilation and this kind of changing that we can change people by changing their environment. They're not bad people. They just come from bad places, and all the bad places happen to be the global South. And I didn't even know euthenics, but I just want to take a moment with the best baby and the pig contest, because I mean, it's so much in there really that I don't think we are I have all this imagery, right? I come from my father's side of the family were farmers, and it is very much about focusing on getting the right kind of, they had hogs and the sow. And so when you said the best baby, and I'm but that's I remember my grandfather talking about a sow and what she was so good because she produced all these the little hoglets that she would look how much the sow can produce. And I was very much familiar with eugenics. You hear it, and it definitely is embedded in slavery, right? And particularly for slave holders, right? And focusing, but I had no idea that so I just wanted to highlight that, anybody who might be listening, wait a second, you need to Google it. That is
yeah, it blew my mind. I mean, as I'm doing this work, I myself just shocked at how much of my own history I don't know as an American, as a woman in America, as a mother in America. I'm wow, this is shocking. And it's not that long ago. This is my great-grandparents' generation. I mean, my grandparents' generation. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's not that long ago. So I'm putting this up on a slide because we are talking about this. I'm going to say things I do not believe, and I don't want anyone to quote this out of context and say, oh, Tammy and I.
Helen Richards said it. Helen
Yes,
Richards said
yes.
it.
So,
Helen Richards said it. There you
thank
go.
you. So this is a quote from a work by Ellen H. Richards called Euthenics, the Science of Controllable Environment, a plea for better living conditions as a first step towards higher human efficiency. And even that word efficiency comes up all the time in this literature.
Mhm.
And so this is first published in 1910. It's a very influential work. It's where the definition of euthenics comes from. So I thought it would be helpful to read it so that you can actually see how from the very beginning, euthenics and eugenics were closely related, because I think what people will be surprised about when I finish reading this is what euthenics results in, which is policies. I think most people are like, what? So I want people to be aware of this. So let me go ahead and read the quote. So again, Ellen H. Richards wrote, not me, wrote that, quote, human vitality depends on two primary conditions, heredity and hygiene, or conditions preceding birth and conditions during life. Eugenics deals with race improvement through heredity. Euthenics deals with race improvement through environment. Eugenics is hygiene for future generations. Euthenics is hygiene for the present generation. Eugenics must await careful investigation. Euthenics has immediate opportunity. Euthenics precedes eugenics, developing better men now, and thus inevitably creating a better race of men in the future. Euthenics is a term proposed for the preliminary science in which eugenics must be based. End of quote. It was out of the euthenics movement, and again, colleges had euthenics departments or concentrations, okay? And this is where most women's education was occurring, because women being educated in the 19th and 20th century in colleges was mostly so they could be good wives and mothers, okay? And so what comes out of the euthenics movement are the women's parenting journals. They're really mothering journals that are giving you mothering advice. They're not giving parenting advice. They're directly giving mothering advice. Home economics courses, okay? All of this comes out of euthenics, and we still see some of it today, and it's highly gendered, and we still see it as highly gendered, right? But what I want, before we move on to intensive mothering, because one of the things you and I have talked about a lot, and I think you can speak to this very well because of your work, but what this eugenics and euthenics movement does is it says that it's a mother's labor to produce good citizens, and this is how she must do it. And here's what a good mother is, and here's what an unfit mother is. But at the same time, it's contradictory, because who it labels as unfit mothers are often the people who are forced to do caring labor. So I'll let you speak about that.
Well, we were talking about this too, because and even like way back when I was looking at mother's pensions and just sort of how looking at the development of this through a gendered lens, one of the paradoxes in all of this that I think we cannot highlight enough is that while you're like the ideals, like this kind of race improvement through environment and hygiene and all these other things, of what then gets termed as a really good mother, right? And this goes back to the earlier conversation in the podcast on narratives and controlling images. And Parent Magazine for years, up until very, very recently, almost uniformly, and I say almost, featured white women, right? It featured a certain type of class of white women, right? So like the homes being featured in the parent magazines and the mothers at the park being featured, and this kind of intensive parenting that we'll get to, but it never really talked about the group of people who were largely during this time and now responsible for doing the bulk of the caring and the nurturing labor, and that's Black and brown women. It is still largely in daycares, in private homes, and outside care, like caring for children that are not necessarily your own, right? And so the paradox in this,
think about the term domestic labor, right?
Right, domestic labor and doing it. So the paradox of eugenics and euthenics is that through eugenics, many women of color lost the ability to actually parent. This is going back to reproductive justice, to have children of their own. And those of us who had children of our own, and I'm thinking about even my grandmother, my mother's mother
Say
lost
why.
were denied. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Say why though, because not everyone knows, especially white people, don't know this history. Many African American women were sterilized without their consent or knowledge.
Without consent for either
that.
having too many babies.
Yeah.
And this continues all the way until now, and where we have not necessarily African American women, but immigrant women in 2015, 2016, in Georgia, who were sterilized while they were in ICE detention without their consent. And denied. So the denial of mothering and the denial of either mothering and having your own children, right, has overwhelmingly been a position. This goes back to white womanism, something has been denied women of color, Black and brown women. The very same women who may have been sterilized under eugenics, because again, we're talking about racial purity and we're talking about fit race, are often the same women who have been then forced through indenturitude and through other structural differences in the marketplace to parent and to raise children that are not their own. All the while, eugenics is saying, it's through environment and through this knowledge, like this kind of technocratic knowledge of mother involvement of women who are not necessarily doing the labor and who are not necessarily doing the function. And it's twisted, it's dark, and contradictory. So to be a Black woman in this time period, and even now, but definitely in this definition, is to be someone who is hereditarily not considered to be fit, and then structurally in terms of the environment. And then we're going to get to intensive mothering and where this, but I know you're going to get to this, but I think it's a good point to talk about how eugenics then becomes this site, and I didn't know the word eugenics until your research, but this also becomes the site of a particularly pernicious and oppressive form of social work practices, school practices that really focus on, because they were considered the good guys. They weren't doing this
is where family policing comes in.
Right. Family policing comes in because they're not necessarily doing the eugenicist sterilization, but I'm going to come in and I will police you. I have already deemed, not I, because I don't want to be constructed, eugenicists and euthanicists. Sorry, I'm not me, because that's not what I believe.
Yeah.
But the ideology has already deemed Black and brown mothers and Black and brown women as being a deficit and coming from culturally and socially decrepit. And so what this says is they'll police you.
Notice what's happened though. You're absolutely right. But because what has happened is there's been a kind of rejection of the eugenics after World War II and seeing what the Nazis did and Americans wanting to distance themselves to it, which is why you don't hear about this history. It's hidden on purpose, right? Is then it becomes, no. A parent isn't a bad parent. We're not saying it because of their race. We're saying it because of the home environment. Because of the community environment. And it serves the same function of controlling and exploiting certain communities, but it's doing it with now this different language of
and policing. Yes. So this, what you're talking about with family policing, and particularly policing of motherhoods and policing mothers, and it serves this function of, this is where you get a lot of the policies and laws and practices that not only remove that currently that we not have vestiges, they're still being practiced today, where you're removing children from homes and you're removing children from families, but it's tied in with eugenics, is tied in a really nasty way to even the boarding schools, Native American, Indigenous boarding schools in the United States, because that's what the euthanicists.
Because now we're going to raise these children in the proper environment so they can, and this is the language they use, kill the Indian, save the child, or save the man. and that man being this future citizen, right?
Right.
So there's a consistent chain here in this history.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And
And
I absolutely, like I said, I just want to say it again. I did not know the term for it is euthenics, which is
I did
very different than and they thought they were good. They were like, this is progress, right?
And
Over
all
eugenics.
along they thought they were doing good. I mean, that's the other thing. I think we have this habit of villainizing because eugenics led to such a horrible thing that we think all of these must have been these evil people going, how can we do things? And a lot of the people involved in this movement thought they were improving the society.
Yeah.
It was a very twisted and bad way to do it. But I think it's important to talk about that because we often make good intentions can lead to really bad things.
Yeah, and they thought what I think is interesting. I was aware of this, and again, we could talk about this in another episode because the way in which I learned about this was through this lens of progressive politics that was happening with particularly white women, right? And they had situated themselves. They were like, look, eugenicists are wrong. They were like, that's evil. And so they positioned themselves in this euthenics way to say that that's what I mean by progress. This is actually, and the term I remember reading like melting pot. This is actually what they mean, by the pot will be provided by now I have a term for it, the euthenicist. This is the pot, and we'll pour everybody in, and then they're all kind of going to come out, which is that assumption that everyone we're pouring in is coming from socially inferior. It's a disease, socially inferior belief system towards everybody else who's not white, and particularly they are white Americans, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so getting up to where we're at today with motherhood ideologies is the intensive mothering. And this also involves cultural contradictions. So Sharon Hayes writes about the ideology of intensive mothering as seeing children as innocent and priceless while viewing mothers as primarily responsible for using, quote, child-rearing methods that are child-centered, expert guided, which is a continuation from that eugenics and euthenics movement, which we'll do another episode on. There's a lot about child study history I'll talk about where they got to the expert guided, emotionally absorbing, labor intensive, and financially expansive. So that's how Hayes describes this intensive mothering. And we can talk about different examples of what this looks like today, but the idea is to be a good mother, you have to do nothing but dedicate every ounce of your being to your child's success. And it is destructive of mother's health and well-being. And it is not healthy for anyone, the child, the society, and so forth. But it is something that's going on very much today. Would you like to talk about some examples of parenting today?
I think some examples that particularly people who have school age children would recognize immediately is all the parental involvement. Parental involvement is its own academic literature enterprise that largely exists a lot of times in schools of education and psychology. But where we counter it as parents of school age kids are the expectations of parental, like that, not only that, and I talk about this with my kids, I was an All-America. I think my mom, she would tell me to pick 3 games. And those are the games I can show up with. 2, parents were not as involved. We're Xers, but parental involvement means that not only parents are expected and constructed as such in school life to actually be at all the games, you also have to do the labor of not only fundraising, you're supposed to provide snacks, you're supposed to provide shuttle service, you are supposed to provide even extra coaching, right? And so that's one area of parental involvement, but it goes all the way through to even checking homework, the assumption that parents aren't reading enough. There's a nice article by Haley Love, and she talks about the parental involvement at one school. And part of it is how much you read to your child, because the assumption, going back to euthynicists, particularly she was studying a largely Black school, is that Black parents don't read to their kids. And parental involvement is the way in which you show you're invested in your child's education is that you have to read at least 10 books to your child a week. And we have a log of the 10 books. And it doesn't include all the other cultural ways that parents show up. It's a very specific way that parents and largely mothers have to show up, have to participate in school activities, have to be in charge of like one lunch a week. And it gets the higher up, and I like the term, what Hayes talks about, financially expensive, right? Because the levels of involvement of what you're expected to do, from, arranging play dates to being involved in sports, to actually being extra teachers, paras, and everything else, tends to kind of add levels of expenses, and particularly levels of stress, like you said, especially if you are like the vast majority of American mothers working full time.
Absolutely. And so it has that, it's there's sort of a parallel to what you were talking about earlier about mothers who were not allowed, or women who are not allowed to be mothers themselves, who are often forced to do this care labor for white mothers and middle-class mothers and so forth. This sort of cultural contradiction. Well, you're only a good mother if you do this, but your ability to do that is limited to a very circumscribed set of circumstances that you are. So if you're a working mother, it almost becomes impossible just in and of itself there. But if you're a working mother with a child with disabilities and you're trying to take them to all of their appointments, well, now you're neglecting their sibling, according to intensive caregiving. There's just all of these elements that it's impossible for the majority of mothers to be fit mothers.
And you can't do it. Right. And so what happens, and again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you have the financial means, because you are actually involved in other aspects of the labor market, then a lot of the parental involvement and what is ascribed as an involved and intensive parenting falls on another person, and your ability to hire other people to fulfill those roles. And largely because if we actually paid people for the time that these roles take, it would be astronomically expensive and out of anyone's ability, except for like the top 1%. Most of the people who are doing this, who are, running the childcare shuttles, like there's a little shuttle practice, not an Uber, but my son's school has it. And it's a service that this family provides, where they pick up kids, not the bus, and they get them to the tutor and all these things that a mother would be doing, but the mother is working. But most of the people who are doing this, because it's so time intensive, are vastly underpaid for the work that they're doing, because that is the only way. So it's all kind of teetering on this really not just delicate but precarious system, where it's actually falling on largely women of color again, and women of color who are not being paid for the labor that they're providing, or not adequately paid for the labor that they're providing.
So I actually think, before we end, it's worth just restating these concepts.
Yes.
Because if people walk away with one thing today, it's really understanding the work we're doing at Mothers on the Front Line, why we're all about flipping scripts about motherhood, is because ultimately we want our kids to get what they need and deserve.
Yes.
And the policies, we're focusing on motherhood and care. We'll do, again, a similar thing on disability ideologies, right? But when it comes to childhood policy, right, it's a combination of motherhood ideology and disability ideology that makes our kids not have the policies that meet their needs. So I think it's worth just restating these, if that's okay.
No, that's okay. Oh, and I also wanted to underscore, because this is central to what we're saying before we restate it, is not just making sure that the kids get what they need and deserve, it is also making sure that the people who care, and largely mothers, get what they need and deserve in the process. So now I'm going to let you restating that.
No, that we always have to restate that, because I think, and I just did that myself. Thank you. We often talk about as though whatever we need as mothers is only for the value of our kids. It's that ingrained. And so we always have to resist and push back against that. And mothers are human beings that are deserving of their own well-being as well.
Yes.
And equally so. So thank you for that. So number one, social policy is ideology in action.
Yes. Number two, I'll go with number two. Narratives express and perpetuate ideology.
Number three, motherhood is a political identity.
And finally, mother blame is used to control individuals and communities.
Thank you so much for this
Thank
conversation
you.
today.
I always like talking to you.
I always like talking to you.